Earthquakes are one of the most terrifying natural disasters since you never know when or where they might hit. But some places, like the San Andreas Fault, are more prone to them, and geologists do their best to predict where one might hit. But despite predictions, the potential devastation that might befall North America is unlikely to be on a small scale. Welcome to our channel, Nature Unraveled. Today, we'll be looking at how an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault might soon be imminent. As the population around the fault grows and the Pacific and North American plates continue to move against each other, geologists predict that people will have to brace themselves for the worst natural disaster yet. A certain amount of terror comes with natural disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, and tsunamis. We know that we are mostly helpless against them, and these unexpected events can leave entire countries reeling from the shock. Among them, earthquakes are even worse since we never know when they might hit, and history has proven that they can be devastating enough to wipe out entire civilizations. One example is the Minoan people who settled on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, in 1600 BC. The civilization was completely destroyed after the Thera volcano's eruption and subsequent earthquakes and tsunamis. And while earthquakes can be felt virtually anywhere, certain areas are more prone to them than others, which brings us to faults. Geographically speaking, a fault is a fracture between two rocks, but when this fracture exists along a plate boundary, it is called a transform fault, and it's usually when the plates move horizontally to each other. This means that rather than one plate pushing onto the other, both tectonic plates are moving in opposite directions. Since the plates are mostly equal in distance, there are constant earthquakes in the surrounding areas. Most faults are found under the ocean, but some are extremely well known on land. Just wait until you find out about the fault that got an entire movie made on it. The San Andreas Fault might be familiar because of its namesake movie, San Andreas. You might have guessed already that the city is located on the fault, which means it frequently experiences earthquakes on a smaller level. While the one depicted in the movie seems a little extreme, it isn't too far off from reality. Of course, rather than the heroic acts of a few people, we'll focus on the widespread damage they can cause. The San Andreas Fault extends for over 1,200 kilometers, and it's the longest fault in the world. It's along the boundary of the Pacific and North American plates and moves about 20 to 35 millimeters per year. But you'll be intrigued to know how it was discovered. The San Andreas Fault began to build around 30 million years ago, but it wasn't discovered until 1895. It was first noticed by a professor of geology at UC Berkeley, Andrew Lawson. He noticed its northern zone and named it after the San Andreas Lake, but its importance wasn't fully understood at the time. That's because the plate tectonics theory only became dominant in 1970, which means that the fault's link to earthquakes wasn't apparent at the time of discovery. In fact, when geologists Mason Hill and Thomas Dibley first suggested that the plates along the fault were moving laterally, it was seen as radical. It wasn't until decades later that the theory was proven correct. But that doesn't mean there wasn't extensive research on the fault, especially considering its devastating history. Geology shows that there's a very good reason earthquakes occur so frequently on the fault. We all know that scientists have observed plate tectonics to trace the history of the Earth because while the crust we reside on is solid, the underlying mantle is not. This means that the tectonic plates are in constant movement, and this movement means that certain plates, in this case the Pacific and North American, can move against each other. Since they aren't smooth, there is friction between them. It's this friction that causes stress to accumulate, which is eventually released in the form of earthquakes. It's also why earthquakes and fissures along the fault are so common. Research on San Andreas shows that earthquakes of high magnitude, usually 7 or above, occur once every 200 years. This number is calculated keeping the plate's slip rate in mind and considering the last large earthquake's offset. It's also part of what has allowed geologists to calculate the next large earthquake on the fault, one that could be so large it would cause extreme damage to areas on the fault. Even if getting exact numbers isn't possible, we can see the regularity that exists because of the fault by looking at the Parkfield earthquakes. Now, if you want to know more about interesting geological happenings, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to get an update every time we post. Parkfield earthquakes. Studies on these earthquakes help geologists discover a certain regularity in stress buildup, which is why they're so confident in predicting the next big disaster. The name refers to 6 earthquakes, all of magnitude 6, that occurred in the town of Parkfield along the San Andreas Fault. Now, what sets these apart from others is that they happened at reasonably regular intervals, 12 to 32 years apart. This means that there was an earthquake almost every 22 years. They occurred in 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934, and 1966. But what really sparked the study on the San Andreas Fault was a 1906 disaster, the Lawson Report. The 1906 earthquake was so extreme that it led to the destruction of 80% of the city, with 3,000 people dead. It hit a magnitude of 7.9 and remains the deadliest earthquake in the history in all of the United States. Naturally, the earthquake sparked extensive study into the San Andreas Fault and its relation to earthquakes in an attempt to predict the next one. The Parkfield earthquakes also contributed to the research, as they were an obvious example of a pattern. The earthquake led to the need to research what caused it thoroughly. A state earthquake investigation commission with Andrew Lawson at the helm started compiling seismographic records from around the globe, including the movement of the fault, the amount of damage, and the underlying geography of Northern California. This culminated with what became known as the Lawson Report, which has played a significant role in predicting future earthquakes. A 2006 study published by Nature got the ball rolling for what could be the biggest natural disaster in America. The study was conducted by Yuri Fialko, who found that the stress buildup on the San Andreas Fault had reached a level that an earthquake of at least a 7.0 magnitude could hit at any time. What made it even more likely is that the stress was concentrated on the fault's southern side, which only formed around 5 million years ago. This is because the 1857 and 1906 earthquakes were on the central and northern sides respectively, but there hasn't been one on the southern end for around 300 years. While Fialko claimed that an earthquake was imminent, other reports have varied according to updated seismic findings. A U.S. Geological Survey report from 2013 claimed that there was a 7% probability that an earthquake of magnitude 8.0 or above could occur along the fault. However, they didn't neglect its possibility. A previous report in 2008 looked into the prospective damages a 7.8 magnitude earthquake could cause, and it found that around 1,800 deaths and damages worth $213 billion were easily possible. But despite the varying predictions, it seems that science is leaning towards an earthquake happening, even if we don't know its exact time frame. One technique scientists have tried refining is the potassium-argon dating technique. It uses potassium-40, a naturally occurring mineral that decays into argon gas. Scientists can reduce its emissions to observe earthquakes because it's released when something heats the rock and restarts the potassium-argon clock. While this technique isn't advanced enough to narrow down the timeframes yet, it has been enough to indicate that stress levels around the San Andreas Fault are enough to cause significant earthquakes. The situation is extreme enough that Thomas Jordan, director of the Southern California Earthquake Center, has said that the fault looks like it's locked, loaded, and ready to go, according to the Los Angeles Times. If an earthquake around the southern area does occur, it will cause widespread damage to the Palm Springs, Indio area and the regions around Los Angeles. This would include Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Diego County, as well as several others. This is because several segments of the fault seem to have accumulated a lot of stress, which would make the damage extensive. But even if an earthquake in the southern area doesn't occur, it isn't necessarily good news. It might serve as a conduit for shaking in the central and northern regions instead. The fact remains that an earthquake is inevitable since there's scientific evidence for it. We must always be prepared because a natural disaster isn't something we can predict, we only know it's coming. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and of course your feedback. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more valuable content just like this. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss a video. Thank you for watching.